Yayoi Kusama is an artist that I simply can't get enough of. I am fascinated by this woman as well as the immense body of work that she has done over her 7-decade career. Kusama was born in Japan, and while she was still quite young, a mental disorder developed in which, when she looks at the world around her, what she sees are proliferating shapes and forms that stretch out all the way to infinity that are just constantly multiplying themselves. And so sometimes these shapes are dots or spheres, but they can be other shapes. However, over her career, and she's worked in many, many, many different art forms, whether we're talking about performance art or painting or sculpture or installations, throughout her career, what she has frequently used are dots or spheres and reflective surfaces as a way of trying to help to capture this visual image of the proliferating forms around her. In the 1960s, she moved from Japan to New York City and became quite involved in the art scene there and established herself as a conceptual artist, particularly well known for doing performance art. And what she would do is she staged what were called happenings. Now, happenings were a particularly 1960s thing in which an artist would have a concept and then invite people to come and participate in the performance art that was based on this concept or plan. But then once everybody was there was a tremendous amount of freedom for improvisation and spontaneity. Now, she loved that sense of improvisation, that sense of spontaneity. And so we're going to see that in the work that is in our image set that we see photographs from right here. In 1966, when she was still living in New York, she went to the Venice Biennale. Now, the Venice Biennale is an international art show, but the thing about the Venice Biennale is that artists must be invited to participate in the show. They must be invited in order to display their art. Well, Kusama was not invited, but she simply made the decision that she was going to go anyway. So she went and she brought along with her 1,500 mirror balls, and she dressed up in a golden kimono and laid these 1,500 mirror balls out on the lawn in front of one of the buildings there at the art exhibition. And she had a sign. We can see this sign that has the name of the installation, Narcissus Garden, along with her name right here. And in addition to that, she put up a sign that said, "Your Narcissism for sale." And then she proceeded to offer the mirror balls to anyone who would buy them for $2 a piece. This is a way for her to recoup some of her costs, as well as to comment on something else that we'll get to in just a minute. But before we move to that, I think it's really, really important for us to think about this title, Narcissus Garden. So when she puts up a sign that says, "Your Narcissism for sale," what exactly is she saying? Well, okay, so what exactly is narcissism? Narcissism is complete and total self-involvement. Someone who is a narcissist, and there's narcissism in all of us, but some have narcissism certainly more than others. But people who are particularly narcissistic think only of themselves and very rarely show any interest in those around them. They never ask questions. They're only interested in themselves. They see the world around them through the lens of themselves. So this is based on the story of Narcissus from classical mythology. Narcissus was this beautiful young man who happened to see his own reflection in a pond. And he was so taken by this beautiful person that he saw in the pond that he leaned over to kiss this person. And when he did so, he fell into the pond and drowned. Now, we can tell that story from classical mythology is a cautionary tale against the dangers of too much self-involvement, too much self-love. And so what Kusama has done is that she's acknowledged that narcissism is something that she experiences herself as well as in many around. And so by creating this exhibit, she not only is able to give us a sense of what these proliferating forms stretching out around us must look like for her, but she also gives us the opportunity to confront our own narcissism. Well, now how exactly does that work? As we look at the balls, as we look at these mirror balls, we can see the reflections of the people, of the trees, of the buildings, and they are just endlessly repeating. But what happens is that when you bend in, when you lean over and look at the balls more closely, then what you see becomes distorted. And so you get this distorted, spherical view where everything in this field around you is your own image looking back at you. And so what it's doing is it's providing for the viewer this confrontation with the false, distorted view of the world we have when we are crippled by our own self-love, our own egos, our own narcissism. So what happens when she is out there selling these mirror balls for $2 a piece? The organizers of the Venice Biennale are really unhappy about this. She wasn't authorized to be there at all. And so they come outside and they order her to stop selling the mirror balls. They tell her that you can't just sell art like it's hot dogs or ice cream cones. Well, as it turns out, by doing this selling like this, what Kusama was also doing was her own rebellion against the art market. Now, the many artists, young artists, in the 1960s were becoming completely disillusioned with the art market, in which what would happen is when a young artist started producing, as soon as people started hearing about this young artist, then entrepreneurs, art collectors with lots of money, would go and they would snatch up works by these artists. And then as the artist became better known, then those works would go up in value. The collector would turn around and sell those works for sometimes huge profits. And of course, none of that profit went to the artists themselves. And so what Kusama is doing by selling these mirror balls is actually calling attention to that phenomenon. So after the 1960s, what Kusama does is she ultimately is going to leave New York. She, in spite of being enormously creative and productive, she did not get the same amount of attention, the same amount of respect that other avant-garde artists such as Andy Warhol was getting. And so she went back to Japan and apparently went through something of a dark time. She checked herself into a mental health facility and has lived in that mental health facility voluntarily for the past 40 years. She was once asked whether she would like to be cured of her mental disorder, and her response was, "I don't want to cure my mental problems. Rather, I want to use them as a generating force for my art." And so she continues to have this mental disorder in which she sees the proliferating forms. But she has used this throughout this entire period. She checks herself out of the facility each morning and goes to her studio down the street in Tokyo, and then she returns after working each night and has continued to do works that are absolutely phenomenal. Now, the work in our image set, we see the photograph of it right here. Narcissus Garden has been reinstalled in many different places around the world in the decades since. We see it here having been installed out in the middle of a pond with a fountain, and so when it's installed in a fountain, then the connection to the myth becomes even tighter. But her work has, I remember I was in London and walked down the Thames, and there were trees with these red polka dots on white plastic, and they just were completely wrapped around the trees that stretched for like a mile. And so that was one of the things that she did working with polka dots. Most recently, the work that I have seen that I just adore is called Infinity, and there are mirror rooms in the Infinity exhibit in which there is a freestanding sort of little room, and on the inside of this room, the interior walls are completely covered with mirrors. And then there are lights up at the top that are different colors. And then there are portholes that go around the exterior walls of this object. And so viewers stick their heads through these walls, and there they get this view of these proliferating forms that just sweep out into infinity and cause us to think about our own visions of infinity. So if we were going to ask questions about this work, I think it would be important for us to think about in what way was her performance a rebellion against the art market that was typical of young artists in the 1960s. I also think it's important for us to be able to talk about in what way do Kusama's works represent conceptual art. And then another question that I would want us to be able to think about is in what ways are there connections between the work that she has produced and the mental disorder that has dominated much of her life. So I invite you to learn more about this fascinating artist.